Shabbat shalom, everyone. I have to admit, I'm a little bit old school, and I still get the local paper delivered on Sunday mornings. And in the past 2 weeks, I saw two things in the Dallas Morning News that jumped out to me. The first was an extraordinary 5-page spread on the future of downtown Dallas on December 29th that was titled Decoding Downtown, How Dallas's Urban Core is Changing and Where That May Lead Us. The Morning News' best reporters shared their take on the future of the heart of our city. Increased transit and housing, providing new opportunities for people to be downtown 24/7, the growth of an extraordinary arts district, and several companies that still proudly call downtown Dallas home despite ongoing challenges since the 1980s. As I was reading it, I started thinking about the great contributions of our Jewish community to this city, both historically and today, including by some of the folks who are in the room tonight. Our little Jewish community has had an outsized impact making Dallas what it is today. The second piece was a bit more frustrating. On the first day of Hanukkah, December 26th, page 2B of the Dallas Morning News showed a picture of two people lighting a Hanukkah menorah celebrating the first night. There were, however, two big problems with this picture. First, the caption showed us that it was members of the Arlington Messianic Community Center. As you all know, folks that consider themselves Messianic think that they are in synagogues and that they are Jewish. In reality, every major Jewish movement has agreed that these are Christians pretending to adopt Jewish traditions rather than actual Jews. Messianic churches, though they say that they are a part of the Jewish people, are decisively not Jewish. Judaism's particular discomfort with Messianic churches, more than any discomfort with a regular church, stems from their ahistorical ideology. Take, for example, the holiday of Hanukkah. The rabbis were the ones who formalized the ways in which we Jews celebrate holidays like Hanukkah or Passover or Yom Kippur. And they did so in a world in which the temple was destroyed, and the Jewish people had to adapt their practice to fit a new world without the temple in Jerusalem as the beating heart of our tradition. The problem for the so-called Messianic people is that Jesus came before the temple was destroyed. The historical reality is that Christianity developed concurrently with Rabbinic Judaism. The Judaism that we know and love today developed completely distinctly from Christianity. Not one floor of a new house, as some Christians like to argue, but two separate houses entirely. To try to then recombine those two houses together fails to understand the historical development of either, and it's particularly bad when it comes to holidays like Hanukkah, when we follow the rabbi's rules for celebration. Now, to make matters worse, in the morning news, the photograph had 8 candles lit on the first night. Now, there is a rabbinic tradition. It's a minority opinion that calls for lighting 8 candles on the first night, offered by Hillel's arch-rival Shammai. However, that position has never been accepted by any Jewish community. So the fact that the Dallas Morning News ran a picture of a group of people who believe in both Jesus and follow the order of Beit Shammai was, to say the least, a frustrating disappointment. Our esteemed local paper made up for it the next day. They ran a picture of our outward-facing ultra-Orthodox friends at Chabad, a sect of our people that also have deep Messianic instincts. Ultra-Orthodox Jews represent a slim percentage of actual American Jews, let alone Jews in a place like Dallas. The Jewish folks that had an outsized influence on making this city what it has become, who helped make the Decoding Downtown section possible, they weren't living in an eruv, and they weren't dressing like they were still in the old world, and they certainly weren't pining for some sort of Messiah or wanting to become Christian. That's what made them different from their neighbors and made them Jews, while at the same time allowing them to integrate into the city and have that significant impact. Together, this combination of Hanukkah allusions and the newspaper made me feel a bit hopeless about the perception of liberal Judaism, both within the Jewish community and beyond. worrying that the messianic fire on one side will try to convert us to Christianity, and the frozen ice of ultra-Orthodoxy will try to ensure that our community stops adapting and changing to the world around us. I want to quickly define what I mean by liberal Judaism, because liberal here has nothing to do with the lingo of our political liberal versus conservative dichotomy. I mean the word liberal here in the religious sense. Liberal Jews range from the most assimilated to the modern Orthodox, who strive to find balance between embracing our Jewish tradition and embracing the modern world and the core values that underlie it. Think, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that human beings are endowed with certain inalienable and individual rights. Liberal Jews all have the freedom to go to the baseball game. Now, we might disagree with each other on whether it's appropriate to go to the game on certain days of the week, or on what food we might eat or bring with us to the ballpark, but there is a consensus that as liberal Jews, we inform ourselves of both the modern world and the Jewish tradition, and then we make a decision. As a result of living in this tension, liberal Jews don't often define Jewish practice as right and wrong, although there are some red lines. We see room for debate and disagreement, and we appreciate that as a value. For much of the 20th century, liberal Judaism was the dominant form of Judaism in American life. The Christians who were cosplaying as Jews didn't really exist, and the ultra-Orthodox, like our friends at Chabad, were minuscule segments of the American Jewish population. But things have changed. Let's take, for example, the growth of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. While there was a sense for a long time that the ultra-Orthodox were nearly wiped out by the Holocaust, that feeling of being pushed into a corner, of being underrepresented in American Jewish life, has created a certain zealousness. That's part of why Chabad's shluchim, their shaliachs, are so successful. They believe that they're spreading true Judaism to people that have forgotten or lost the way. The problem, however, is that a lot of the rest of us grow up learning to look at Jewish life like that with a nostalgia effect. We look over our shoulders at the ultra-Orthodox and say, that's the religion I don't practice. In the 21st century, it sometimes feels like we forget that big tent liberal Judaism, with all of its complexity, is not only a valid and real interpretation of the Jewish tradition, it is the authentic way to understand Jewish history and live Jewish life today. It's rooted in a genuine understanding of how we relate to the world around us as Jews. The oldest example of liberal Judaism that we can turn to happens to be in our Torah portion this week. Parshat Vayigash concludes the dramatic saga of Joseph and his brothers. As you will recall from a few weeks ago, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers in Egypt. He became a servant in the house of an Egyptian priest, but ended up in prison. Through his fortuitous dream-telling, Joseph emerges from prison and becomes Pharaoh's prime minister, managing the food stores for the empire during a famine. When Joseph's brothers come to Egypt in search of food, he plays a trick on them to see if they've learned their lesson. Seeing that they were unwilling to leave behind their brother Benjamin the way that they had left Joseph behind, he revealed his true identity to his brother, and he forgave them for what they did wrong. Within the Joseph telenovela, we can see an amazing transformation of Joseph as a character that shows a model for liberal Judaism as an authentic Jewish practice. In an extraordinary 1966 lecture called The Blessing of Assimilation, Rabbi Gerson Cohen, who is the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, points out that Jews have a tendency to think, and I'm quoting him here, Jewish vitality in the past has derived in large measure from a tenacious adherence on the part of our ancestors to all the basic external traditional forms. In reality, he argues, Jewish people have actually consistently adapted to the world around us, and he gives us 3 examples that we happen to see from Joseph in our Torah portion this week: our relationship to our names, our clothes, and our language. First, the Torah tells us that Joseph adopted an Egyptian name, Zapaneth Panea, whatever that means, and married an Egyptian woman. I want to show of hands, how many of you have a Hebrew name in the room? All right? A few of you are going to put your hands down on this, maybe some Adiels in here. How many of you is your Hebrew name the same as your English name? Right? And how many of you would you have to change the pronunciation a little bit to make it your English name as well? I go by Michael instead of Michael because my experience in high school or at Starbucks would be a little bit more difficult if I were Michael. But by adapting my name, I am much more able to thrive in the world and contribute to its growth and development. It doesn't mean I don't have a Hebrew name, but I adapt it to make sense in the world that I live in. Second, when Joseph's brothers met him, they didn't even recognize him. I assume from this, then, that Joseph was wearing Egyptian clothes and speaking Egyptian language. I'd argue that Judaism is still here today because we've been comfortable adapting our language, because I am giving this sermon in English and not in Hebrew. Unlike most great ancient stories, our ancestors were comfortable translating our foundational story into new languages. The Jews of Alexandria did this first with a Greek translation known as the Septuagint, and it allowed the Jewish community to understand the Torah despite the fact that they weren't all fluent in Hebrew. Jewish languages like Yiddish and Ladino and Judeo-Arabic, those were mostly just languages that people spoke in their own place, mixed with an inflection of Hebrew grammar and some Jewish words and concepts that other languages didn't natively have. By adapting our language and then translating our Torah into the language we actually speak, we've allowed our tradition to thrive in places where that might not otherwise have happened. It's also why it's mind-boggling to me to see people wearing Russian fur hats on Shabbat in the middle of the summer in the desert in Israel. The ultra-Orthodox clothing isn't old-school Jewish. Moses wasn't wearing a black suit and a black hat on Mount Sinai. I know it feels obvious, but I think we have to say it. That clothing represents what Jews in Eastern Europe wore right before the modern world came to be, give or take a few years around 1789. For the illiberal Jews who don't want to embrace the modern world, it's not shocking that their clothes come from the Russian Empire in the 1700s. But the rest of us, on the other hand, actually dress like Jews. We wear jeans and ties and dresses because, as Joseph taught us, part of being Jewish is fitting into the world around us. With all of his adaptations into Egyptian culture, I think Joseph teaches us the most important lesson in this. He doesn't forget who he is, despite all of that. And he doesn't forget where he comes from. He remembers his tradition, his story, his values, and his God. In what some say is the first recorded moment in human history of one human being forgiving another, Joseph breaks all established norms in this story with his brothers. He doesn't take revenge on them, but he forgives them, and then he brings his entire family to Egypt. He knows it's still important to take care of your family, and he carries forward the values that come with his tradition and his upbringing. Even Gerson Cohen pointed this out in the 1960s, when he said, "There have always been opportunist and despondent people who've preferred to identify totally with the majority and have slipped away from the Jewish community. God forbid we become them. But with an actual lens of Jewish history, we understand that great ages of Jewish creativity were born out of a response to the challenge of assimilation." Gerson Cohen concludes his piece by sharing some Torah and wisdom from Nachman Krochmal, a 19th century Galician Jewish scholar, who said, "The Torah is very much like a path that is beset on one side with freezing cold and on the other side with consuming fire. We must all work our way to the middle so that we can derive the benefits of both the coldness and the warmth." If you read the local news during Hanukkah, you might have seen pictures that purport to represent a Judaism willing to dive headfirst into that consuming fire, the Messianic Jews who seek to exploit our tradition as part of the latest trend of Christian supersessionism, or to freeze on the tundra of ultra-Orthodoxy, keeping Jewish life and Jewish values in a past that no longer exists. This Shabbat, as we begin our secular new year, as we welcome in the year 2025 for all of Dallas, may the story of Joseph inspire us as we remember to take pride both in our ways in which we assimilate and adapt into the world around us, but reminding ourselves that we're also living our authentic and real Jewish lives. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.